Welcome, folks. My name is Stefano Picozzi, and I'm a OpenShift specialist based in Australia. I've been working in that segment since we went GA back in 2012. So over that period of time, I've had an opportunity to sort of be involved in a number of projects around OpenShift and PaaS and helping organisations adopt this sort of new technology. So what we're going to do in this particular session is we're going to look at some of the challenges around change and technology adoption around a technology such as OpenShift in platform as a service. And the basis of this is going to be from our experience with the University of Technology, Sydney, which actually appears as a case study at the Red Hat site that you can download. In fact, UTS were going to be with me today, except at the last minute they couldn't make it. But I've been able to get a sort of web clip where they're going to be talking about exactly what they're doing with OpenShift at their university. So this is a sort of organisational change, culture, people-centric view of the technology, but I think hopefully it's a sort of different sort of insight into what you may commonly be hearing about OpenShift. So just before we get going, I'll just sort of put a question. So what do these sort of things have in common then, right? Star Wars, Mad Max, Hot Tub Time Machine, OpenShift Enterprise, any guesses? It is true. They're all available on subscription from Netflix or Red Hat. That is true. Sorry? They're all fantasy. They're real. I'll show a demo. Yeah. They all come in containers. Is another one actually. But actually, what for the purposes of today's session, what they've all got in common is they're all an example of the hero's journey. So even with OpenShift, the scenario that we commonly deal with is the change agent that's our hero, right? So for our case, it's James Lucas, who was the IT services manager at UTS. And so what we find in the sort of hero's journey from James Campbell is that something happens in the environment that breaks him out of his funk, right? They need to do something different, right? Then he goes on a journey, he meets a guide, he may find some sort of new sort of important knowledge, and then he applies that and it takes it back into his world to make a change. That's the sort of hero's journey. And with OpenShift, I often see that same pattern repeated, where James Lucas and others are facing a challenge in their particular industry, and then they may discover some sort of new technology that makes sense to apply to it to actually address that particular problem. In this particular case, it's often the vendor or myself that is actually that mentor or guide that helps the hero through his particular journey. So what we're going to do in today's session is that we'll walk through this particular hero's journey being the change agent in terms of what he did to actually apply PaaS technology effectively to actually make a difference in his organisation, because that's actually one of the biggest challenges with this sort of new technology. Before we get stuck into that, I'll just give you some context around the sector that we're operating in here. So here we're in the higher education segment, specifically as it is experienced in Australia. University of Technology is a participant in that particular space. In case you weren't aware, higher education is actually a major contributor to GDP in Australia. It's actually our largest services sector. It's actually even bigger than tourism. And it's in fact the fourth largest contributor to export earnings overall, behind the sort of traditional sort of resources and minerals and energy sector. We attract a lot of students in the sort of APAC basin because we're in that particular catchment. So a lot of foreign students actually are trained in Australia, and that's very important for us, both from a strategic point of view, but also of course from a revenue perspective in terms of drawing in export income. So it's a very important sector for us. But like every sector, even the university sector, there are challenges out there. There are disruptors in the marketplace that people need to sort of take care of. And in the case of the university and higher education sector, there are a number of sort of changes in the field. One of them, say, being MOOCs and the globalisation. MOOCs being, massive open online courseware, and the potential for globalisation where sort of major brands can reach out and provide services around the world, potentially brands like Harvard, MIT, Stanford, etc., that may have greater prominence than some of our own universities. So these are all factors that are sort of disruptive in that marketplace that is a trigger to consider sort of changes that need to be done to accommodate it. So no industry is spared, even in higher education and especially in Australia. And that means that that's a trigger for individuals in sort of IT services space to look at what they can do to actually manage this particular competitive threat. So that sort of prompts people looking at sort of ways that they can be, more responsive, agile and adaptive to respond to these sort of new market conditions. And that's where I'm sure you've heard about things such as moving from a sort of scale up to scale out, from a monolith to microservice, from a mode 1 to a mode 2 type of operation. This is the sort of thing that people are looking for in a sort of, a new future state technology to provide that sort of agility. But in the context in this particular session, what's actually more interesting is the changes that are needed from the organisation and the way people behave in that organisation to actually affect those improved outcomes of agility. Because at the end of the day, it's people that write the software that cause a disruption. Software development is a social activity. So what we're looking for in this sort of future state is sort of behaviours that encourage, better teaming, better feedback, more experimentation. These are the sorts of things that we're looking at from a technology in this future state. And that's the role of OpenShift and a platform as a service in the context of organisations that are trying to respond to these particular challenges. And in fact, what's interesting about platform as a service in the context of this session, looking at the challenges of a change, is that this is a kind of shared infrastructure that touches many stakeholders, right? It's a cross-constituency concern. It's a technology that impacts architects, the business, developers, operations. Everyone has an opinion of this particular technology, and so that also presents a particular challenge in terms of adoption of this sort of technology inside the enterprise. So it's sort of a double-edged sword in the fact that OpenShift, a platform as a service, impacts right across the organisation. That is also puts in a position where it's a really strong lever in terms of driving change and improving outcomes, because it can really drive that innovation through the organisation, taking great ideas and turning them into products. But at the same time, that means you need to accommodate the concerns of all the different stakeholders to actually push this sort of technology through the organisation. So part of our challenge and sort of things that we uncovered at UTS and similar organisations is that we've got to find a way to get key decision makers that represent those different functions to think outside their box to sort of greater common purpose of the organisation so that they can then collaborate towards an agreement or shared understanding of what actually needs to be done. So later on, I'll be looking at some tools and techniques that we've surfaced and harvested as a result of UTS and other organisations to address that particular problem. And that's probably the key learning from all the activity that we've done around platform as a service, certainly in our market. Okay, so for our intrepid change agent hero in this particular context, there are a number of sort of steps that we went through in terms of actually delivering a final outcome, and I'll touch on a number of these today as we walk through his particular journey. But so there's no need to sort of be linear about this, so we can go straight into sort of the trigger and the results from the actual experience of applying platform as a service in the context of this particular university. Okay, so I gave you a quick background in terms of the higher education segment in Australia and the importance it is to our particular economy. In terms of this particular customer, which is the University of Technology Sydney, that was established in 1988. So it's an organisation that's under 50 years of age. So it's a relatively young university. There's a Times University Index that sort of tracks these and ranks these organisations. And so it's ranked, number 21st amongst the top 50 of those organisations that are sort of under 50. So it's certainly it's in the top 50 of the under 50 universities in the world. It's already got over 40,000 students, 3,000 employees. Almost half the student population are not from native English-speaking countries. So it's a very sort of multicultural, polyglot sort of landscape that we operate in. So universities, as I mentioned earlier, obviously they need to find a way to differentiate themselves in their particular marketplace and the offerings they make, especially in the context of potentially, global threats and competition. And so what the University of Technology chooses to do to differentiate itself in that particular context is focus on providing sort of practice-based teaching. So a sort of a learning experience for their students that's sort of very much in touch with industry. So it places them well in terms of their career prospects going forward. But sort of rather than me explain that, what I can do is I can play you a little clip that we captured before I left. So unfortunately they couldn't make it. So what I did was I worked with one of the academics there to sort of capture a quick clip to describe what they're trying to do. So just as a background, this is we've kept it very real here. One take, no rehearsal, no script, sort of low production values, but you'll get a sense of what's going on. It runs for about 2.5 minutes.
So part of our learning strategy is practice-based learning, and so we want students to be learning skills and skill sets and technologies that are going to be easily transferable to the workplace. And one of the challenges for students in learning to develop software at enterprise level is that there's an awful lot of technology that they need to understand in order to be able to develop new technology. And so the kind of problems that we were having is that students would have to spend a lot of time setting up and learning to understand technologies like setting up web servers, setting up database servers, Git repositories, and those kind of things, which are challenging to students who are already having to learn a lot of new skill sets. And so we were looking for an environment that would make a lot of that much more automated and perhaps smoother, so that the students could focus on the development of software as a team and collaborating on the development of new technologies rather than being distracted by having to set up technology environments in order for them to do their development. Okay. So UTS started doing a pilot of the enterprise version of OpenShift, and somebody in the IT services came to me and told me about OpenShift and suggested that it might be a solution to the kind of issues that we were having with student teams developing software, and suggested that it might be a way of the students learning enough about the surrounding technology to be able to use it without being too distracted by it. So in the software development studio, in which we do practice-based learning for software education, the students work in teams on specific projects for real clients, and so we're part of the pilot project for OpenShift. So UTS uses OpenShift in their IT services, but we were going to use it in a different manner because we were using it with the students as part of their learning experience. Using a technology with OpenShift has changed the relationship of the academics who work in the software development studio with the IT support services, in that we as academics and the students are no longer as reliant on IT services to set up infrastructure for the teams to work with when they're developing new technologies. The students can decide what technology stack they want to use that's most appropriate for their project, and they can basically go in and set it up themselves with very little input from IT services directly. We've used OpenShift with a number of teams in a pilot study, and a couple of teams have used it since then, but our plan in the future is that the students in our software development studio in particular, if they are developing web-based, cloud-based type applications, they will have to use OpenShift as a technology to support the development of that.
Okay, so in this particular story, James Lucas from IT Services is a change agent, and then enlists the support of a business or user sponsor, being Julia Pryor, in terms of sort of driving adoption of the technology. So what Julia mentioned there was a sort of a number of use cases of the application of platform as service in the context of the university. And so sort of a second learning point, as well as an earlier one we described about getting all the different stakeholders on board, is certainly in terms of driving adoption and is the establishing actually the utility of the technology to meet the concerns of sort of different functions inside the organisation. So certainly we're able to do that with OpenShift in this particular case. And one that was mentioned was around this idea of the software development studio. So what they're trying to achieve here at University of Technology Sydney is that software engineering teams, work in these teams across the full life cycle, and they can come and go and enter in at different points of that life cycle. And she mentioned something about the otherwise sort of tedious, complex activity around tearing up and setting up all the environments that are needed to actually get on and actually address the sort of technical problems that are part of the course at that particular time. So there's a term here called yak shaving, which I think captures that pretty well. So the yak shaving is, I guess, borrowed from pop culture, but it's this idea of that all that sort of useless activity one needs to do before and overcome before you actually get to solving the actual real meaningful problem that you're trying to address. So that's the sort of idea of yak shaving. So this is a sort of lexical gap in that, there isn't a nice, neat word that sort of captures that particular issue. But certainly one thing that OpenShift does is sort of take the drudgery and tedium out of that otherwise yak shaving, time-wasting activity. Another issue they had there, of course, was that the alternative is sort of multi-tenanted container-based model for hosting workloads that you have in the PaaS context. The traditional model is typically around virtual machines, right? And then you have this issue of the sprawl of expensive, heavy VMs, especially when you're trying to support a large student body. So how do you get around that? Well, obviously, there are benefits around the platform as a service model with technologies such as OpenShift in that you can densely support and multi-tenant many, many containers representing many, many student workloads cheaply over a long period of time, which fits in well and traces back well to this sort of practice-based learning approach. And then there are other benefits too in terms of it's supporting and facilitating other requirements in supporting the sort of software development learning around team and role and collaboration. So that's one example where it sits in well in terms of applications in the university context. And I think this is a sort of use case that translates to really every higher education institution that's providing sort of programming undergraduate software engineering courses. Another application and use case is around something such as conference websites. So every organisation in this sort of space is forever hosting conferences and events all through the year. Each one of these typically requires building up some kind of microsite for managing registrations and hosting content, etc. And some of the challenges around that is that there may be requirements that the data is sensitive, so it may need to be maintained on premise, for example, and also that these sites need to remain around for quite a long period of time. There's a very classic long tail sort of distribution in terms of access, where there's a high throughput at the beginning, but then they need to be hosted for an extended period of time to service the needs going forward when academics and attendees want to pull down content. So that's a pretty expensive proposition, and as you get more and more of these sites, it's difficult to scale and manage, and there's a risk they become insecure. And again, this sits in well in terms of the platform as a service technology space, in that you can use that it's easy to build such sites. The container model and workload model allows us to host those sites and passivate those sites when they're not being used. And you may be familiar with OpenShift, this idling behaviour, right? Where if a site's not being used, it can be passivated away, it's not drawing down system resources, and therefore you can densely host many, many, many of these sorts of microsites at sort of with low costs to the system. So that's another example in terms of the utility of the software in the context of the university segment. And then there's a whole range of other applications that they also use at UTS, which are, I'm sure, replicated in other university contexts. In their particular case, for example, they had been embarked on a major sort of building program, and that building program needs to comply with sort of new standards around green and energy management. So there's a whole bunch of applications that they need to provide sort of visibility and metrics and monitoring into those particular systems, which again fit very well into that sort of mode 2 application development space. That is a good fit with a technology such as OpenShift. Actually, I might just do a quick poll. Who's familiar with OpenShift and the basic benefits of it? Okay, so really briefly, so OpenShift is a platform as a service. It provides basically a tooling and an abstraction layer over infrastructure that makes it really easy for developers to build applications for the cloud, okay? There's sort of basically 3 key experiential benefits that it provides, right? For developers, they get the benefit in terms of autonomy, right? They're able to self-serve to satisfy their particular development requirement. The benefits for operations staff is that it provides very standardized control, okay? So they can get visibility and control into the environment and all these applications that are being built according to the standards that are maintained by the platform. The benefit for architects is that it ensures that architectural principles and guidelines and standards are adhered to. Developers build applications, the technology stacks are automatically provisioned from the platform, and so that ensures there's compliance with the standards in the organisation. So OpenShift then provides a sort of productivity, make it easy to put to the cloud, and ensures that the needs of developers, operations, and architects are appeased in that particular outcome. So I don't go too much into OpenShift, the product here, but there's many, many streams that go detailed into the technology, feature, function benefits. We're focused here more on the challenge in adopting that technology in a typical context, such as a university here. Okay, so that's an example of the use cases in the university technology context. I think a lot of them are very reproducible in other similar higher education institutions. And the theme there was one around utility, right? Which, to drive adoption, if you can establish utility that meets the needs of different functional groups in the organisation, that helps move along the adoption process. Okay, to get to the particular point of benefiting from those sort of outcomes and those results, there are obviously some key steps that were required just before we got there. So what I'll talk about now is some really key activities that were executed and some of the sort of characteristics of those events that are very specific and peculiar to platform as a service, and they represent things that we've learned about deploying and applying this technology. And I can summarise that as sort of workshop and pilot activity, and I'll go into how we actually did that. Okay, so with going back to the context setting earlier on, I talked about, so one of the main challenges around a shared infrastructure technology, such as a platform as a service, is that it impacts and is of a concern right across different constituencies, right? Business, architects, developers, operations, they all care. That means this sort of shared infrastructure, the actual deployment of it can be derailed if there's a dissenting voice amongst that particular group. Okay, so when it concerns multiple stakeholders, that's great because that's a great lever for innovation, but it's also a great risk because it's fragile in terms of being accepted. So what we do to appease that particular risk and drive the project forward is we try and gather the key stakeholders together, sort of to build a shared understanding of what the opportunity is about. What is the relevance of this technology back to the business? And then to sort of rally around an action plan to execute that particular outcome. So we call this a sort of narrative workshop for the want of finding a better term for it. But ultimately the idea is to show me the narrative, right? Find some common understanding about the purpose of this particular project in a way that everyone across those different functions can relate to, because we're trying to break through these particular silos. So there's a particular approach that we go through from this. Ultimately, it's a workshop that occurs very early on in the actual deployment process. Before we get into, say, detailed use cases around implementation, and the actual execution of this workshop, which ultimately consists of gathering key decision makers from those different constituencies, from those different constituencies into a workshop. It's typically difficult to gather those people for an extended period of time. So this all typically occurs within a few hours, like a morning or an afternoon. Okay, in designing this particular workshop, there's a number of elements that come together to actually as a basis for it. And one is there needs to be some sort of underlying change model, okay? We're in the moving business here, right? We're trying to move people so that they agree that the current state is a problem and we need to reach some future state, right? In the change model that we sort of use to underpin the particular process we go through in the workshop is that we need to address sort of three basic factors, right? We need to address hard benefits, soft benefits, and some approach or risk management to actually move forward through that. In other words, we need to appeal to rational concerns, emotional concerns, and to find small, simple steps that people can take to actually get on that particular journey. So this is all pretty well-defined approaches in sort of change management literature about helping people move from a current state to a future state. It's called the elephant and the rider and the path, and the kind of metaphor here is the idea that rational concerns are represented by the rider. They tend to be sort of outweighed by emotional concerns, all right? And so the idea is if you're a rider trying to, steer an elephant through a dense forest, okay, you think you're in control, but you're quickly going to run out of energy, right? Ultimately, it's the elephant, the emotional concerns that are going to dominate. But you can sort of improve the likelihood that you're going to steer forward to the point, to the destination you're after, if there's some sort of, track in the path through the forest that you can help you through. So ultimately, for us, it just means that we need to address all these different concerns to help people through this particular process. So that's the underlying change model. And then we need an agenda or framework in which to actually process through the particular workshop so that we satisfactorily surface all the details we need. And to do that, we follow, the very, traditional 5WH model. Okay, so sometimes this has been popularised as sort of Kipling's method because it appears in a particular book he wrote, but this goes back thousands and thousands of years to ancient Greece, right? Ultimately, every workshop should follow this sort of particular agenda of calling out what, why, when, how, where, and who. Okay, the third element that makes up the way that we approach these particular workshops is we need to have some sort of goal-setting framework around it, right? And, like in the social sciences, one of the most robust findings that there is that if you want to sort of bridge the intention-action gap, right, you need to set goals, okay? So the way we approach that is using a hierarchical goal model so that we can establish sort of, what are traceable business outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So an example of applying that particular model is that you may have a high-level goal, which is to increase business agility, right? By encouraging experimentation, taking some sort of specific action, which in a platform as a service context could be something such as self-service environment provisioning. That's how we sort of establish traceability and goal setting that's relevant to the need to apply and adopt this sort of particular technology. And it's all these sort of elements together that help then form and surface a narrative around the reason for the project. Another area that we need to cover, of course, is on the rational side, the hard benefits. There are a number of different approaches to how people do this, but sort of one way we've learned through our experience in this sort of context is that there's sort of two different ways people do this, right? The vendor can supply some tools and the customer needs to accept it and they work through it. Or alternatively, is that you can take a sort of more collaborative approach. So we try and focus on a collaborative approach here, which is working with the customer, exposing what the assumptions are so that we can then identify what are the sort of economic benefits around using this particular technology. So these are sort of choices in terms of how we approach that. So these are all the sort of elements in the mix around guiding people through that narrative workshop to form that shared understanding between senior decision makers in the organisation, which is a non-trivial thing to do, but must be done because if you don't, you're at the risk of the project failing or derailing because there's a lack of consensus. So this is the hard stuff. In terms of what actually happens in these sorts of sort of workshops, I've sort of got an example here. And so to protect the guilty, I've got one that's not from UTS, but from a number of others that I've done. So what tends to happen is, and there's quite a pattern that I've found over doing these sorts of things, is that you're in a period of a couple of hours. It actually can take up to an hour to actually identify the reason that we're doing the project, to actually surface why are we here and who are we doing it for. Okay, you'd be surprised. So even with senior decision makers from those different constituencies, could be the business, could be architects, head of operations, development, etc. It's amazing the lack of sort of agreement or consensus in terms of what's really important about the business. So here's one that we finally got to for an organisation in a kind of electronic document management sector, but it actually took over 45 minutes to get to that particular point. And that pattern's replicated over and over again. But you can see, though, that if it's that hard to get to that point, what hope have you got in terms of shared infrastructure if you haven't actually got that narrative? Okay, once you get past that, you've established the why and the who, right? Why are we doing this? And who in the external world are we trying to do this for? Because that's what creates value, right? then we can get to the what, okay? And then that's when you finally might start teasing out some traceability between technology, such as platform as a service, and the benefits that it brings to the table, and tracing that back to what the business is trying to achieve. So obviously with platform as a service, that provides benefits around standardization, self-service, multi-tenancy, etc. And these are benefits these are characteristics that can be traced back to sort of business outcomes, which could be in terms of, quality and cost effectiveness, right? In terms of business speak. This is important because ultimately, shared infrastructure, you've got to convince a lot of people. You've got to be able to present your case to senior management that may not understand IT about the value of the technology. And then once you've got to this point, then you get to the sort of the how and when and where, right? What exactly are we going to do to prove this? So this typically surfaces out as, say, an experiment in terms of to validate an assumption or hypothesis around the proposition that you're making in terms of the value of the technology. So from this example here, basically the agreement was that they would implement platform as a service in a segment of the life cycle in parallel, and then compare that to a baseline of the existing process, and then measure metrics such as variability and velocity to see what benefits they're actually getting. Okay, so that, but once you sort of get to this particular point and it's worth it, you've got a really concrete narrative in terms of the project, okay, shared across senior people, across the organisation, and that then gives sort of foundation to actually moving forward. And if you don't do this, you do actually run a risk of derailment. Okay, then sometimes organisations don't have a sort of clear understanding or knowledge about that path, right? What that first step should take. What should that experiment be? What should that POC look like, right? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. When they don't, they sort of need to look for, a vendor such as ourselves for guidance in execution. So again, this is another sort of thing we learned through the process and at UTS, which is that, as I'm sure you can appreciate, when you do these POCs or pilots, especially for new technology, they're a risky proposition, right? It's new technology in an organisation. If they fail, that can actually jeopardise and derail the original business initiative, all right? So there's actually a lot of risk associated with these events. So you need to mitigate that particular risk, and one way to mitigate that, of course, is to have some kind of proven, repeatable approach that you can rely on in terms of the execution of the POC. Okay. If we go back to the sort of hero's journey, right? If you sort of project that out on a sort of linear timeline, you get a classic story narrative, right? You have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? And what you have in these sorts of scenarios is that there's a steady increase in tension leading to a climax as things are actually resolved, right? A catastrophe follows a crisis, right? And I don't know if anyone's done a POC, but pretty much every POC I've ever done takes that sort of pattern, right? Until you finally get a solution. So that's a hint, right, in terms of how we actually approach that POC process. So an option that we provide then customers, and we did this at UTS, is that if they don't have a clear understanding in terms of what that first step should be, we provide then a very prescriptive approach that they could take, okay? And we call that sort of ready, set, go. And again, this is an example of methods and tools that we've, I guess, harvested in the field to solve the particular change and adoption problems that we encounter in pushing forward new technology such as platform as a service in organisations. So what we do in this sort of ready, set, go approach is, again, we organise that into a sprint of a launch phase, installation phase, and then we move into actually execution and testing of use cases, leading up to a final presentation. And what's sort of, I guess, interesting about this particular process is that it's actually the client that leads the presentation, okay? So it's not the vendor taking ownership, it's the client that leads it, they're actually delivering it, they're actually explaining what they've achieved, what they did in the POC back to their own constituents. Of course, we're supporting them in that process. So that's exactly, in fact, what UTS did. And we actually sort of narrowed this down into a very, very compressed, in fact, 1 week window, okay, to actually make this happen. from beginning on the Monday to presentations in the boardroom on the Friday. And of course, we can make that happen is because we try and control all the risks through that particular process, right? So plan, check, adjust every single step to ensure that we're meeting and passing all the criteria. So this is the sorts of things that we've done to help reduce the risk around these sorts of activities, to give confidence in terms of organisations that are taking that first step, improving the value of the technology. And one of the important sort of parts of that process is around finding a suitable representative fleet of applications that they can use to actually host on the OpenShift platform as a service platform to validate the utility. And what we then do is work with the client in terms of sort of triaging their technology landscape to find suitable candidates for migrating or modernising on the PaaS platform. That then sort of provides, you can't see it here, but ultimately prescribed use cases that then represent the success criteria that we use for the POC. So that sort of just summarises the examples of sort of what we do in terms of really key steps in the adoption process. Getting the stakeholders on board early on in the process via the narrative workshop, forming the narrative, and then if they need help in terms of forming that first experiment or POC, then we can provide that sort of guidance as well. So we've got a little demo for, just to show you examples of what we can now do. So in the last couple of weeks, James Ferguson, who's a lecturer in statistics at UTS, came to me and said that one of the things they're trying to do is teach statistics to their students. And the technology they want to use to do that is based on R. Anyone that's familiar with R, or really any technology set, will probably appreciate there's quite a lot of complex configuration to do in terms of setting up the student's environment to conduct the labs that they're provided. And then the lecturers and support staff typically have to write up documentation installation procedures to represent what they need to do. So they're all very brittle. The configuration can change, new versions come on board, and the whole process starts repeating itself. It's quite a complex. So this is an example of the typical yak shaving that's required to support students through the learning process. So is there a better way? Yes, there is. So what you can do, for example, is package up an R development environment as a Docker container. And you just need to do that once. OpenShift can then run that container workload and make that available to all the students. So that means that there's no actual student set up on their side. And more importantly, from the training provider's side, there's centralised configuration. So even though the configuration may be complex to begin with, at least you only do it once, and then you can control any changes. And also, that also means that, if a security incident happens or there's a new patch required, again, that's all centralised, and you can actually push out new versions of it. So it's actually quite a radical change for what people would normally do in terms of supporting their students. And again, taking the yak shaving out of the student experience so they can focus on the real problem, which is solving statistical problems with this particular technology. So just to give you an idea what that looks like is that the setup to set up R is basically about installing various statistical packages a student might need to solve statistical problems. And there's all sorts of different examples of that, right? And ultimately, if you didn't do it, the student would actually have to do it. But what you can do with the Docker model is take that, set it up once, and create a container for it, okay? Once you've created a container, that then becomes a permanent, immutable image that you can publish to a registry, okay? So I've actually done that, and so what I've got is, what you're seeing here is an RStudio server instance published to what happens to be a public registry, but that then becomes available to pull down and use, right, once. And the students can't tamper with it. They can't actually change that setup, okay? So at least you're guaranteed a uniform, consistent environment. Once you've done that, then you've got a standard container according to the container packaging format known as Docker. And that's the one used in OpenShift version 3. And that opens up the door to lots of other exotic technologies that we can actually run on OpenShift. And then OpenShift then provides the runtime quality of service experience around those containers, right? It will run the workloads, it will scale them up, it will, manage the interaction between the student and the actual server. So this is now looking at the OpenShift version 3 console. So this is a beta version, right? I think we went GA, I don't know, today. So I've been working with some of the older versions of that. So just by having that published image, I can take that and host it up onto OpenShift untouched, the original container. So that's now available on OpenShift as a workload that can then be accessed by students, which means that you can then provide an R environment for doing statistics using this particular Studio IDE, but it's running from OpenShift, right, from the server. So students are not doing local configuration. It's all being serviced from a central location managed by OpenShift. And that's then available to use, just to give you an idea. And the only thing, and if we're to actually install this into OpenShift, all you're actually really doing is just telling it to grab the image from the public repo and run it on a particular port and away you go. But there's actually no sort of coding required. So that's sort of an idea of what you can do in terms of OpenShift v3 in a university context. So UTS are on version 2 because that's what obviously was available at the time. But these are examples of things that we can do with the next release. That would have been slightly trickier from a technical point of view before. Yeah, so just to highlight again, so what the platform as a service is doing here is that it's running those containers that are providing that R development environment. It's running them and hosting them according to the quality of service required. How many instances of it are there? And also you can then attach external storage. So as students are creating statistical programs and R labs and authoring content, that can be stored in external storage and saved and persisted, so the state is actually saved. So that's a lot of fun. Okay, last couple of ones here. So back to the sort of change agent's journey in terms of adoption of this technology. We've talked about some of the results and benefits they've got, some of the sort of key actions that we took to actually deliver that particular outcome. Highlighting with that, 1 week intensive sort of POC process we went through to actually build the pilot, which is they're using today. Then in the lead up to sort of establishing a need and demand for the technology, another important aspect is around education and awareness, okay? Exposing people to the capabilities of the technology from the general user base. This is a really important part of technology adoption, especially with a PaaS that can be new to a lot of people. So Red Hat takes a lot of care in terms of what it does there. You may not completely appreciate. So this is now in the space around technology diffusion models, right? Driving forward the use of technology, making people aware of it. What's interesting sort of now is that you may be familiar with, traditional models of technology adoption, right? Begins with enthusiasts, professionals, and then becomes a wider consumer product. Faxes, typewriters, all sorts of technologies have followed that pattern, yeah? What's happened now, of course, is the internet, open source has changed everything. It's now what happens is that all these different sorts of areas are sort of interacting at the same time, right? People learn about technology from their work at home, right? And then they bring that to their workplace, and they sort of drives technology use there. So there's an awareness and a multi-dimensional experience in terms of how technology is adopted and experienced in the world today. And that's reflected in, the way that the OpenShift sort of products are organised, right? In offering options that are relevant to the general community and hobbyists, options that are relevant to, hardened enterprise commercial applications, and of course, options that are relevant to use by the general public and consumers via OpenShift Online public cloud service offerings. So this means that individuals have a different way that they can experience their technology for the first time and bring that back to the enterprise. And what we've done with OpenShift, of course, is that sort of, projects out into quite a continuum of different entry points in terms of how people can experience their technology. And in the case of the UTS, the way they actually did it is that their initial experience of it was from the free tier and from the open and from the community version, and they were actually using the community version, building cartridges, and rolling their sleeves up and experience the technology for themselves without our guidance. That's sort of the way the journey began. So, but the other thing we sort of learned in this context is that this is great, and it does give a lot of different entry points to sort of drive adoption. Another one that sort of related to that we found very effective is hackathons. Okay, both civic and enterprise hackathons. OpenShift, with its sort of free tier offering on the cloud, provides a great platform to support sort of hackathon type activities. So we found that to be a very effective way to actually expose people and diffuse the technology and use in the organisation. So that's sort of one of the learnings around this, and that's sort of unique to OpenShift that may not necessarily be as easily available with some of the other Red Hat offerings. So that's the approach that we've taken in terms of technology adoption from the awareness side. I guess to sort of close up this sort of particular journey, you can't escape the challenges around organisational culture, right? So there are particular challenges there, and I'll sort of talk about some of the things that we've done in that respect. So on the architectural, on the culture side, what you typically encounter is that you've always got these organisations that are organised around these different functions, yeah? And you've got dev and ops, and they've got particular concerns, right? So from the dev's perspective, they're interested in change and choice and speed. From an ops perspective, of course, they're interested in control and governance and quality of service. So there's sort of competing design tensions between the groups, and in many organisations, these groups don't typically interact or team very effectively. This really cuts to the chase with a shared infrastructure such as OpenShift, because now you're bringing all these groups together, right? But before you get there, you typically are entering organisations where there is a chasm between the groups, right? And you need to cross that sort of empathy chasm. And this is where we get back to sort of another one of our sort of lexical gaps, which is that the way these individual groups see themselves may not necessarily reflect how others see them, right? So from the ops perspective, they may see dev as those people that have those creative ideas that always just cause trouble, right? From a dev's perspective, they see ops as the Central American term for adowoso, which is one who sees problems with everything, yeah? So these are examples of what I always encounter 100% of the time in terms of organisations and that sort of empathetic divide between these sorts of groups, and we're trying to actually bridge that with technology. And the lesson around all this is that it's not the cart before the horse or the horse before the cart. You need the cart and the horse. You need to address these issues with the adoption of technology. And thankfully, this is sort of where we start to converge around DevOps. Okay, so in DevOps, you might be hearing about this, but ultimately DevOps is this philosophy around encouraging behaviours such as teaming, feedback, experimentation. Yeah, and the point is that if you encourage those behaviours, then that's going to be associated with better outcomes, better quality, faster time to market, reduced waste. And so what the DevOps area does, though, is usefully it informs us of particular practices that you can take to deliver those better behaviours. Yeah? And so that's where they would talk about things such as setting up small, long-lived cross-skilled teams, embedding development people in IT operations and vice versa. The whole point of these DevOps practices is that these are techniques that will get people talking, right? So you start bridging this divide between dev and ops because you're going to apply practices that will get them working together, okay? Technology plays a role here, and so obviously something like OpenShift makes it easier and more satisfying for those groups to work together, but you need both at the same time. So that's what we're doing with DevOps, and that's where we start to get to the last point around this, which is laying down the architecture around OpenShift to actually making it actually work. And this is where the learning here is that you do need to give up a little bit of control. So if you're an architect involved in this particular space, some of the approaches in the past may not be as effective, yeah? And the analogy I like to make here is that, you may start with the best of intentions about your design and what it's going to look like, but when you add people, things take a sort of different tangent, yeah? Because it's really hard to control what they want. They've all got different particular needs. So the moral of the story here is that when you're planning and designing around the diffusion of a technology such as OpenShift, and you want to encourage those sort of teaming, feedback, experimentation behaviours, that is really ultimately the objective. You need to think of it from a point of view of what you're really doing is setting the conditions or the groundwork for good ideas to emerge, right? You want to encourage adherence. You want people to use the technology because they find it satisfying, okay? And that's where you set up this sort of, virtuous cycle of positive reinforcement that leads to those outcomes, right? So people will team, people will experiment if they're working with technology in an environment where they feel autonomous, where they feel they've got choice, where there are automation tools to make things easy. And if you do those things, that will result in outcomes around increased velocity and better quality and reduce waste. And that then becomes a consequence that reinforces the behaviour, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a behavioural economist would probably talk around something like a choice architecture, right? You're nudging people to make choices that are more desirable, right? And the choices that we want them to make are choices that encourage better teaming between the different groups. And that's ultimately the end state that we're trying to reach for in terms of modernising our technology and behavioural landscape to deliver these outcomes to be more agile and responsive and adaptive, etc. So that's the kind of journey around UTS and some of the things we've learned. And some of the things that are relevant in terms of making that innovation magic happen, which is ultimately what we're trying to achieve with a platform as a service technology like OpenShift. And it touches on a number of different areas, behaviour change, the fact that the cross-constituency concern of the technology, the sort of technology adoption models that we talked about, letting go a bit to let people make better choices. And then, very importantly though, the skill and art and consultative art really of getting the key stakeholders and decision makers together to agree on a narrative about why they're doing it in the first place. Yeah? And which we've talked about some of the things we do to help that along. In terms of the sequel, so that describes the UTS experience with the technology as captured in a case study that appears on the Red Hat online site. Obviously, they're now moving forward to look at planning for more expansive implementations and hopefully, obviously, going on to version 3 in time, etc. And things such as that planning workshop, narrative workshop, we're using with them to actually set the narrative and set the priorities around what these future states are going to look like for these subsequent phases. So to sort of close up here, right? So hopefully, the moral of the story in this particular session is that the story is the moral, I hope, right? Which is that there's a lot of value in actually, working, capturing and narrating the story around your experience with the technology, yeah? Ultimately, that can be, a very effective tool for change, which is hearing about and listening to how other people have done it can be very persuasive in terms of helping other organisations make similar choices. So I hope if Red Hat sort of approaches you about sort of working on a case study that you consider it favourably, because it is quite a rewarding experience and you learn a lot from it. Okay, it helps your peers, it helps you, and obviously it does help Red Hat as well. So I hope organisations that go down this path will tell their story as well.